Truth never arrives gently. It breaks the surface like a blade, revealing what we refuse to see. Loneliness is not a modern accident. It is the ancient pulse beneath every crowded street, every illuminated screen, every noise we use to escape ourselves. And before any theory, before any age of reason, Dostoevsky had already exposed this fracture at the core of the human creature. He confronted the soul where it is most naked, in freedom, in fear, in the trembling desire to matter. His voice still cuts through the noise of 2025 because he spoke from the underworld of consciousness, not from the podium of certainty. Before we continue, you are gently invited to subscribe, leave a like, and share a comment. This channel is a small space for grounding and reflection, created for those who seek a calmer way of understanding themselves and the world. If you feel comfortable, tell us where you are and what time it is for you. Your presence here matters, and your words help. Weave a quiet community across the distance. May what follows bring you ease, clarity, and a softer place to rest your thoughts. Dostoevsky understood what many still overlook. The human being is not a straight line, but a collision of forces. Reason tries to dominate, desire tries to escape, and the self becomes a battlefield, pretending to be a person. This is why his philosophy remains urgent. It strips away illusions, demands a confrontation, and refuses to let us hide behind the comfort of explanations. Modern life has not solved this tension. It has only disguised it more skillfully. Beneath productivity, beneath digital connection, beneath curated identities, the same trembling questions remain. And it is precisely here that the journey into the body of philosophy begins, a descent into the layers beneath our own narratives, guided by the writer who dared to reveal what most still conceal. Now we move toward the core of the text, where the argument sharpens and the real excavation begins. Freedom is never the blessing we romanticize. It is the wound that exposes what we truly are beneath every borrowed certainty. Beneath the polished surface of human life, freedom stands not as an open door, but as a blade pressed against the soul, demanding, what will you choose when no one chooses for you? Dostoevsky saw this truth long before our age wrapped choice in illusion, before algorithms claimed to understand desire, and before societies insisted they could design a life without anguish. He revealed freedom as the ancestral scar of existence itself, the mark we spend our whole lives trying to deny. His vision was not political theory. It was the confrontation between a trembling human being and the abyss of possibility. And he confronted that abyss with the authority of one who had tasted prisons, executions, despair, and resurrection in a single lifetime. To grasp his idea of freedom, we must first strip away the comfort of modern definitions. Freedom is not about rights. It is not about autonomy in public squares. It is not about the ability to move, to vote, to own, to speak. It is the raw encounter with the self, when every external script collapses. Dostoevsky understood that the human being is born into freedom, the way one is thrown into a storm, violently, without preparation, without instruction. The 19th century still believed that progress could rationalize the human condition. Philosophers hoped structure could soothe uncertainty. Yet Dostoevsky whispered an older truth. He said that when all the rules disappear, when all the explanations fail, we begin to sense the terrifying clarity that no one can live our life for us. This insight did not elevate humanity. It unsettled it to the core. The first branch of his argument is stark. Freedom is suffering because choice is weight. Every act divides the universe into what is and what will never be. The burden is unavoidable. The misunderstanding that freedom equals happiness is a lie society tells to soothe itself. Real freedom tears the mask from the human face and forces a reckoning. You cannot escape your decisions. You must carry them. And once carried, they transform you irreversibly. Dostoevsky insists that suffering is not the failure of freedom. It is the proof of it. Only creatures who choose can ache this deeply. The second branch cuts even deeper. Human beings resist freedom precisely because it exposes their responsibility. We want safety, direction, predictability disguised as virtue. We want others to guarantee our well-being so we can blame them when life disappoints. The common misinterpretation claims that individuals naturally desire liberation. Dostoevsky shows the opposite. He reveals how often we sabotage ourselves, cling to authority, hide behind conformity, all to avoid the terror of owning our destiny. People adopt convictions not because they believe them, but because convictions relieve them of the burden of deciding. The conclusion he drives toward is brutal. Freedom is not a gift given. It is a task demanded, and most of us flee from it. The third branch exposes the final paradox. Freedom is destructive until it becomes conscious. The childlike freedom that demands pleasure fractures into chaos. The self-indulgent freedom that seeks rebellion collapses into emptiness. The naive belief that unlimited choice leads to fulfillment dissolves as soon as one must live with the outcomes. Here lies the misunderstanding. People think freedom is expansion, but Dostoevsky argues freedom is confrontation. Only when one sees the shadow of one's own will and chooses anyway does freedom transform from wound to awakening. The conclusion is sharp. A human being becomes human only when they accept the abyss beneath their choices and step forward anyway. Yet this ancient truth has not softened with time. If anything, the modern age has sharpened its cruelty. Today, in the world of 2025, freedom appears available everywhere. We choose careers, identities, relationships, beliefs, lifestyles, all with a swipe. But these choices are so curated that they no longer demand us. They merely entertain us. Technology has erected the illusion that decision-making can be outsourced to recommendations, trends, or statistical predictions. Society rewards compliance disguised as self-improvement. Algorithms anticipate desires before we feel them, and the human interior, once a battleground of will, becomes a passive landscape shaped by invisible hands. Modernity has not solved the tragedy of freedom. It has concealed it beneath convenience. But concealment does not erase existential weight. When a choice no longer feels like an expression of self, but a performance of expectations, the human psyche fractures. This fracture is quiet, subtle, corrosive, It lives in the uncertainty whether one's decisions arise from authenticity or from the pressure to appear coherent. And beneath this uncertainty grows the anxiety Dostoevsky recognized as the spiritual sickness of free beings. Our age fears silence because silence exposes this tension. We drown ourselves in stimulation because stimulation keeps us from seeing the truth Dostoevsky made unavoidable. Freedom is not comfortable, and any life that avoids discomfort becomes unreal. To understand this sickness, we must descend into the psychological core of existence. Human beings fear freedom because freedom reveals their nakedness. We fear choosing because every choice betrays the infinite alternatives we cannot pursue. We fear responsibility because it removes excuses. We fear agency because agency eliminates the fantasy that someone else should fix our brokenness. And above all, we fear ourselves because within every choice lies the possibility of error, guilt, shame, and irreversible consequence. The psyche invents defenses, rationalizations, blame, cynicism, perfectionism, obedience, rebellion for its own sake, anything to avoid. Answering the brutal question, what do you truly want? For Dostoevsky, this question is not about preference, it is about essence. And essence terrifies us because it exposes the secret we refuse to admit, that we may not know who we are. His characters embody this terror. Among them, one figure reveals the birth of freedom most starkly, Raskolnikov. He stands as the symbol of the human being who attempts to transcend morality through pure will, convinced that freedom means exemption from limits. His crime is not merely murder. It is the assertion that the individual can rise above the human condition. But through guilt, delirium, and eventual surrender, Raskolnikov demonstrates Dostoevsky's philosophical blade. Freedom built on denial collapses. Freedom pursued without humility becomes agony. Through him, we see that the path toward authentic agency is not the conquest of others, but the illumination of oneself. Raskolnikov's descent strips away illusions until the truth becomes unbearable. He is not a god of choice, but a trembling soul confronted with the consequences of its own freedom. From this character, we learn that freedom demands exposure. It demands the willingness to see the self without distortion. And in that exposure lies the possibility of transformation, not through denial of guilt, but through acceptance of limitation. Dostoevsky's insight becomes clear. Only when one stops pretending to be invulnerable can one begin to choose freely. The arrogance of absolute autonomy dissolves into the humility of being human, and in that humility, a more authentic power emerges. The ability to choose despite imperfection, not in spite of it. Synthesizing these threads, the truth forms a single cutting line. Freedom is both the origin and the trial of the human being. It is the wound we inherit, the suffering we cannot avoid, the responsibility we resist, and the illumination we desperately need. It shapes our age, our decisions, our loneliness, and our longing. It reveals why modern individuals feel hollow despite endless options, and why even the most successful lives hide quiet despair. Freedom confronts us not with possibility, but with ourselves. And Dostoevsky forces us to see that the deeper we run from this confrontation, the more fragmented we become. What emerges now is not closure, but the tremor before a deeper descent. Because once freedom has been exposed as wound, we must ask the next question. What part of us bleeds when freedom cuts? And what darkness stirs beneath that wound, waiting to speak? Darkness does not emerge from the outside. It rises from the fractures within the self the moment freedom exposes us. When the wound of choice opens, something deeper stirs beneath the surface, something older than thought, something that refuses to be disciplined by clarity. Dostoevsky knew this second layer of the human being with the precision of a surgeon and the dread of a prophet. He revealed that the human self is never a single structure, but a divided territory, with reason perched above like a trembling watchman, while an underground vastness churns below. Long before psychology claimed to map the psyche, he had already drawn the border between the conscious and the abyss. And he understood that what terrifies us is not the darkness outside, but the darkness that carries our own fingerprints. He refused the naive belief that the mind is unified. He insisted that the self is a battlefield where logic struggles against impulses that do not speak in sentences, but in tremors. Beneath every rational explanation lies a desire that contradicts it. Beneath every moral intention lies an instinct that undermines it. Beneath every controlled gesture lies a residue of chaos waiting for its hour. The world of his characters is not fiction. It is the anatomy of human nature stripped to its bones. He warned that the conscious mind is not the ruler, but the narrator who arrives after the event has already taken place. The unconscious moves first. The rational mind merely invents reasons afterward. This inversion is what modern individuals resist most fiercely, because it shatters the comforting illusion of mastery. To unfold his insight, we begin with the first truth. The conscious mind is thin. It is a fragile film stretched across the depth of the self. It presents itself as order, as intention, as coherence, but it is continually betrayed from below. Desire erupts without permission. Fear distorts perception. Memory manipulates the present. The misunderstanding that reason controls the human being collapses under the weight of daily contradictions. We promise and then break. We decide and then retreat. We love and then sabotage. Dostoevsky confronts us with the brutal conclusion that logic is not the architect of our actions. It is the secretary who records the chaos in more polite language. The second truth cuts deeper. The subterranean realm is not passive. It is not a storage room for forgotten thoughts. It is a restless force that seeks expression. It pulses with longing, resentment, instinct, hunger, and wounds that have never healed. It contains the animal, the child, the rebel, the abandoned, the furious and the humiliated versions of ourselves. This depth does not negotiate with rationality. It does not care about moral codes. It moves with the urgency of survival and the creativity of desperation. The common delusion is that one can silence it through discipline, self-improvement, or positive thinking. Dostoevsky exposes this as fantasy. The underground does not disappear, it retaliates. And when repression becomes too tight, the retaliation becomes violent, irrational, or self-destructive. The more the conscious mind tries to dominate, the more the unconscious twists itself into sharper, darker forms. The third truth reveals the tragedy. The split between the layers is not symmetrical. Reason misunderstands the unconscious, but the unconscious understands reason perfectly. It knows how to mimic logic. It knows when to hide and when to erupt. It knows how to turn morality into guilt and intelligence into self-loathing. The misunderstanding we cling to is the belief that mental clarity removes inner conflict. Dostoevsky shows that clarity often deepens the fracture. The moment a person becomes aware of their divided nature, the internal war becomes explicit. One half judges, the other half resists. One half demands virtue, the other half whispers sabotage. The conclusion is merciless. The human being is not a unified consciousness striving for truth. It is a contested territory where truth competes with impulses that do not want to be known. These ancient fractures surge even more violently in the modern world. Today, in 2025, the pressure to optimize the self has intensified the internal split. The contemporary individual must be efficient yet spontaneous, disciplined yet relaxed, emotionally intelligent yet invulnerable, strong yet endlessly adaptable. This impossible duality turns the conscious mind into a tyrant, issuing commands to a body and soul that can no longer obey. In this state, the unconscious becomes a silent revolutionary. It rebels not through ideas, but through anxiety, numbness, procrastination, compulsions, emotional volatility, and the quiet desire to break free from the unbearable weight of being functional. Technology accelerates this conflict. Algorithms monitor behavior, laboratories quantify emotion, workplaces demand constant self-sculpting, and as the exterior becomes more polished, the interior becomes more volatile. Modernity has not unified the self. It has sharpened the divide. In the psychological core, the conflict grows more intimate. The conscious mind fears the unconscious because it contains everything the individual does not want to admit: vulnerability, inadequacy, forbidden desire, buried rage, shame, envy, the longing to be seen, the longing to disappear, the wish to surrender control. These truths do not politely wait to be invited. They surge when the facade cracks. And when they rise, they strip the person of the illusions they have used to survive. Dostoevsky forces us to confront this exposure. He shows that the human being does not fear the world, but fears the self that hides beneath the world. We fear the moment when the polished narrative of who we think we are meets the raw reality of who we might be. His characters embody this two-layered nature with haunting precision. Among them stands the double figure, the man who confronts his own reflection, twisted into autonomy. This figure is not supernatural. It is psychological realism. It is the manifestation of the parts of the self we exile. In Dostoevsky's vision, the double emerges not to destroy, but to reveal. It reveals the cowardice hidden beneath politeness, the rage beneath compliance, the longing beneath cynicism. It shows that identity is not a stable entity, but a negotiation between fragments. And through the appearance of this double, he exposes the terrifying possibility that the unconscious knows us more honestly than the persona we defend in public. The double is not an enemy. It is the truth we have refused. From this figure, we learn that the underground cannot be erased. It demands recognition. It demands dialogue. It demands that we stop pretending to be simpler than we are. The conscious mind, when forced to face the unconscious, often collapses into confusion because it realizes that the self is not a linear story, but a shattered mirror whose pieces reflect contradictory truths. Dostoevsky invites us to hold these contradictions instead of resolving them. He suggests that inner conflict is not a failure, but a condition of being human. A person becomes more real, not by silencing the underground, but by allowing its voice to be heard, without letting it dictate destruction. Synthesizing these layers, the truth emerges with ruthless clarity. The human being is divided by design. Reason cannot survive without instinct, and instinct cannot express itself without the structure of reason. The conscious self organizes life, but the unconscious gives it force. The upper layer speaks the language of order, but the lower layer speaks the language of truth. And the more violently we suppress the lower layer, the more violently it returns. Modern individuals suffer not because they are broken, but because they try to live as if they are single-layered creatures. They deny their contradictions and then collapse under the pressure of their denied selves. Dostoevsky warns that anyone who refuses to recognize their underground becomes a stranger to themselves. And a person who is a stranger to themselves will search the world for meaning while carrying within them the very chaos they seek to escape. Yet the confrontation with this internal abyss does not end here. If the human being is split between reason and chaos, then the next question rises with unbearable sharpness. What happens when the mind becomes aware of its own fracture and begins to turn that awareness against itself? Consciousness, once awakened to its own fracture, becomes a weapon that turns inward and draws blood with every thought. This is the torment Dostoevsky understood with unsettling clarity. When the mind sees too much of itself, when reflection becomes obsession, when analysis replaces living, the human being begins to rot from within. The abyss no longer lies beneath the self. It expands inside the self. And from this expansion emerges a figure who embodies the sickness of hyper-awareness, a figure who is not merely a character, but a diagnosis of the modern soul, the underground man. He is the proof that the mind, when left alone with its own brilliance, can become a cage more suffocating than any external prison. He is what happens when introspection loses humility and becomes tyranny. Dostoevsky wrote him before psychology had a name for neurosis, before philosophy admitted that rationality could crumble under its own weight. He anticipated the condition that would haunt the age of endless information, paralysis born from knowing too much, yet believing in nothing. The underground man is not irrational. His tragedy lies in his excessive rationality. He dissects motives until motives dissolve. He analyzes choices until choice becomes impossible. He exposes illusions until even meaning appears fraudulent. His intelligence is sharp enough to cut through every justification he invents, leaving him naked before his own impotence. And in that nakedness, he becomes the archetype of the self devouring itself. To understand this phenomenon, we confront the first truth. Awareness does not liberate when it becomes surveillance. The underground man watches himself with the precision of an executioner preparing the final blow. Every desire is interrogated. Every impulse is judged. Every emotion is mocked. He constructs an inner court where he is both defendant and judge, both prosecutor and condemned. The common belief that self-awareness leads to freedom crumbles under this weight. Dostoevsky reveals the opposite. Excessive awareness leads to self-entanglement. It replaces action with endless rehearsal. It transforms life into a hypothesis. And the conclusion is devastating. A mind that constantly examines itself loses the capacity to live. The second truth confronts the illusion that knowledge guarantees virtue. The underground man knows what is good. He knows what is right. He knows what would lead to dignity, connection, growth. Yet he cannot choose it. Knowledge, stripped of will, becomes poison. It humiliates instead of guiding. It exposes the distance between who one should be and who one is. This distance becomes a wound that refuses to close. The misunderstanding that moral clarity empowers action collapses in the presence of this character. For him, clarity destroys action. He sees the possible outcomes so clearly that none appear worth pursuing. He foresees disappointment, failure, rejection, absurdity, and foreseeing them becomes an excuse to avoid them. The result is a life defined not by wrongdoing, but by non-doing. A slow spiritual suffocation that feels both deliberate and inevitable. The third truth reveals the most insidious trap: pride disguised as despair. The underground man believes he is superior to those who act, precisely because he sees the futility behind their actions. He hides his fear of failure beneath contempt. He masks his longing for connection with cynicism. He mistakes paralysis for depth. This inversion transforms suffering into vanity. It transforms intelligence into self-indulgence. Dostoevsky exposes the tragic irony. The underground man's torment is real, yet he clings to it as proof of his uniqueness. His misery becomes his identity. His self-hatred becomes a sanctuary from vulnerability. And the conclusion hits with the weight of a confession. He would rather suffer alone than risk being ordinary and alive. These truths resonate violently in the modern world. Today, in 2025, we live in the era of overthinking elevated to ritual. People observe themselves through screens, compare themselves through metrics, analyze themselves through constant mental commentary. Identity becomes a performance reviewed by invisible audiences. One's every move is examined through curated ideals. In such an atmosphere, the mind becomes hyperconscious, always measuring, evaluating, correcting. And this hyperconsciousness breeds the same paralysis Dostoevsky described. We want connection, but fear exposure. We want meaning, but dismantle every belief before it can take root. We want action, but drown in hypothetical outcomes. The underground man is no longer an anomaly. He is a mirror. Psychologically, the torment sharpens. The mind that sees itself too clearly begins to split into layers of internal spectators. One part acts, another part watches. Another part judges the watcher. Another part mocks the judgment. This infinite regression exhausts the will. The simpler energies of life, spontaneity, desire, instinct, genuine emotion, become suffocated by commentary. The person stops living forward and begins living inward, spiraling deeper with each reflection. Dostoevsky understood that this spiral leads not to enlightenment, but to self-erosion. The more one contemplates one's flaws, the more monstrous they appear. The more one questions one's motives, the more artificial they seem. Eventually, the self becomes a maze without a center. The underground man reveals this collapse, not through external events, but through the violence of his inner monologue. He longs for friendship, yet sabotages every gesture of kindness. He craves intimacy, yet strikes at those who approach him. He wants dignity, yet behaves in ways that guarantee humiliation. He is not driven by malice, but by the terror of authenticity. To be authentic is to act without guarantees, to risk rejection, to expose one's raw self to an indifferent world. He cannot bear this exposure, so he retreats into thought, where he can control the narrative, where he can rewrite humiliation into superiority, where he can transform longing into disdain. His prison is made of reflections so polished they cut him. Through this character, Dostoevsky reveals a truth few dare admit. The mind can become addicted to its own suffering. Paralysis becomes easier than courage. Self-contempt becomes safer than hope. The person trapped in this cycle does not choose misery out of preference, but out of fear of living without the armor misery provides. The underground man's condition is not simply psychological, it is existential. He embodies the crisis of a being unable to reconcile infinite introspection with finite courage. And yet, his torment contains a strange lucidity. He exposes illusions others cling to. He sees the vanity in false virtue, the emptiness in social rituals, the hypocrisy in polite morality. But this insight, instead of grounding him, isolates him. Insight without compassion becomes cruelty. Insight without humility becomes distortion. He becomes a prophet of negation, able to deconstruct everything, but unable to build anything. His intelligence becomes his wilderness. His awareness becomes his exile. Synthesizing these depths, a single truth emerges with brutal clarity. When consciousness becomes self-consuming, the self loses the ability to choose. Freedom collapses, will dissolves. The human being becomes a spectator of their own life, watching it drift by with equal measures of disgust and longing. This is why the underground man stands as a warning, not against thinking, but against thinking that fears embodiment, not against awareness, but against awareness that amputates action. He reveals that inner fracture, if left unbridged, transforms into identity. And once identity attaches itself to paralysis, liberation becomes almost unimaginable. Yet something else stirs beneath this paralysis, something the underground man hints at but cannot articulate. If the mind becomes a prison of endless clarity, then the next question rises with the weight of inevitability. What force within the human being can break through the tyranny of reason when reason begins to suffocate the soul? Rationality cannot rescue the soul once it begins to drown in its own reflection. Only something wilder, more primitive, more defiant rises to challenge the suffocating clarity of the mind. This is where irrationality appears not as failure, but as revolt. When reason becomes a cage, irrationality becomes the crack in the wall through which the self breathes again. Dostoevsky understood this with a sharpness that still confronts us today. Human beings do not simply want what is good for them. They want to feel that their choices belong to them, even if those choices lead to ruin. The will does not bow to logic. It demands freedom. And if denied, it will destroy itself just to prove it exists. In this tension between reason and rebellion, the human being reveals its most paradoxical truth. Before psychology named impulses, or behavioral economics measured deviations, Dostoevsky had already exposed the secret. People will sometimes choose against their own interest, not out of ignorance, but out of protest. The underground man, whose hyper-awareness imprisoned him, erupts in irrationality precisely because it is the only force strong enough to challenge his paralysis. He wounds himself to feel alive. He sabotages opportunities to assert control. He rages not because he hates the world, but because rebellion momentarily frees him from the tyranny of clarity. This impulse is not madness. It is the shadow side of freedom. It is the soul asserting itself against the cold machinery of rational expectation. The first truth Dostoevsky forces us to confront is that reason cannot contain the full architecture of human desire. The human being does not want a perfectly optimized life. It wants a life that bears its fingerprints. When society tells us what is rational, efficient, or beneficial, a subtle resistance awakens. This resistance is not stupidity. It is identity protecting itself from assimilation. The misunderstanding that humans always seek advantage collapses under Dostoevsky's gaze. Sometimes we seek the unnecessary, the dangerous, the destructive, because these acts remind us that we are not mere components in a system. They remind us that choice is not a calculation, but an assertion of presence. The conclusion is uncomfortable. Irrationality is not a malfunction, but an existential demand. The second truth cuts deeper. Irrationality emerges precisely where autonomy is threatened. When external structures promise to eliminate uncertainty, failure, and suffering, they inadvertently eliminate the raw material of freedom. The more predictable life becomes, the more violently the soul rebels. The underground man mocks the notion of a utopian world where every decision is statistically optimized. For him, such a world is not heaven, but suffocation. He would rather hurt himself than live in a system that removes the possibility of surprise. He would rather make a foolish choice than surrender agency. Dostoevsky reveals the paradox. Humans sabotage themselves, not because they dislike well-being, but because well-being stripped of freedom feels like death. This paradox erupts with even more force in the modern world. Today, in 2025, everything is engineered to minimize friction. Navigation apps tell us the fastest route. Wellness regimes prescribe the healthiest habits. Recommendation systems predict our desires. Behavioral algorithms guide consumer choices. Society celebrates optimization as though it were salvation. And yet, beneath this smooth surface, human beings feel increasingly restless, impulsive, rebellious. They procrastinate not because tasks are difficult, but because constant efficiency feels dehumanizing. They indulge in distractions not out of weakness, but out of resistance to being shaped by invisible systems. Addiction, self-sabotage, and reckless behavior surge not simply from psychological wounds, but from a deeper revolt against a life that feels pre-written. Psychologically, the roots of irrationality run deeper than mere frustration. The unconscious desires disruption. It craves moments when the narrative breaks, when the self is no longer predictable, even to itself. These eruptions provide a brief escape from the relentless surveillance of the conscious mind. They puncture the suffocating certainty that paralyzed the underground man. Irrational acts become temporary sanctuaries of unpredictability. They restore a sense of unpredictability that systems of control try to eliminate. Dostoevsky understood that the human spirit needs room to erupt, to make mistakes, to fall, to choose wrongly, because each misstep is a declaration of agency. When this space is denied, rebellion becomes inevitable. Irrationality, therefore, becomes a form of existential expression. It reveals what the self values more than comfort: the assertion of will. This is why individuals sometimes reject advice that would help them, cling to habits that harm them, or dive into relationships that will wound them. The unconscious is not seeking misery, it is seeking authenticity. The destructive choice becomes meaningful because it is unmistakably one's own. People will endure suffering if that suffering testifies to their autonomy. This is the terrible beauty Dostoevsky uncovers. The human being would rather fall by choice than ascend by coercion. Yet, irrationality is not only rebellion, it is also confession. It exposes the truth that reason alone cannot heal the fractures within the self. The underground man lashes out not to assert dominance, but to reveal his desperation. Every erratic act is a plea for recognition, for contact, for meaning. His self-sabotage speaks the language of longing, longing to be seen, longing to escape isolation, longing to connect despite the terror of vulnerability. This is the psychological wound beneath irrationality. The destructive impulse arises not from a lack of intelligence, but from a collision between desire and fear. He wants warmth, but cannot bear exposure. He wants companionship, but cannot tolerate dependence. Irrationality becomes the only outlet for a soul torn between contradictory needs. Dostoevsky sharpens the point. Irrationality is a revolt, not only against society, but against the self's own prison. When reason becomes too strict, when morality becomes too rigid, when ideals become too absolute, the soul strikes back. It refuses to be tamed by intellectual purity. It refuses to become a machine of perfect conduct. It insists on being human, with all the darkness and inconsistency that humanity entails. This revolt is often misread as weakness, but in Dostoevsky's eyes, it is proof of life. A perfectly rational human being would not be human at all. Irrationality is the tremor that reminds us we are alive. From this tremor comes the most radical insight. Irrationality is not the opposite of freedom, but one of its expressions. Freedom demands unpredictability. It demands the capacity to surprise oneself. It demands the possibility of error. If human behavior could be completely predicted, mapped, controlled, or optimized, freedom would vanish. The irrational act is the final defense of the self against such disappearance. It is the last place where autonomy asserts its right to exist. In this sense, irrationality becomes an ethical act, a refusal to be reduced to logic. Yet Dostoevsky does not romanticize this. He knows irrationality also destroys. It can corrupt, deceive, fracture relationships, break lives. It can trap the soul in cycles of self-inflicted suffering. The underground man is not free. He is tormented by rebellion. His irrational acts give him momentary relief, but deepen his despair. This is the paradox Dostoevsky refuses to resolve. Human beings are caught between the craving for order and the craving for chaos, and neither can fully satisfy them. Rationality without rebellion suffocates. Rebellion without rationality disintegrates. The self lives in the tension between these two forces, unable to escape either. Synthesizing these contradictions, one truth rises with sharp clarity. Irrationality is the shadow of autonomy. It is the cry of the soul demanding to matter in a world that seeks to shape it. It is the resistance against being domesticated by reason. It is the wound through which freedom bleeds. And in the modern world, where algorithms anticipate our every move, where efficiency masquerades as meaning, where rational systems tighten like invisible chains, this cry grows louder. People break routines not because they are lazy, but because routine becomes dehumanizing. Choose poorly not because they want misery, but because predictable happiness feels counterfeit. They drift into chaos because chaos, at least, feels self-created. Yet beneath this rebellion lies something even darker, something Dostoevsky understood with prophetic precision. When irrationality erupts unchecked, it does not stop at self-sabotage. It spirals into deeper forms of suffering, transforming pain into the crucible through which the self is forced to confront what it truly fears. And from this crucible emerges the next question. heavy and unavoidable. When irrationality pulls the human being toward ruin, what hidden force within suffering begins to reshape the soul from the inside? Suffering does not wait for permission. It enters the soul the moment irrationality has torn open a place for it to strike. What begins as rebellion becomes rupture, and through that rupture, pain floods in with a force that strips away every pretense the self has used to survive. Dostoevsky understood this not as tragedy, but as revelation. He saw that suffering is the one experience the human being cannot fake, cannot outsource, cannot rationalize into disappearance. It confronts us with a truth reason avoids and rebellion cannot answer. The self is transformed not by comfort, but by fracture. Suffering is the crucible in which illusions burn, and the residue that remains is the beginning of something real. Before modern psychology framed trauma, before philosophical systems attempted to sanitize despair, Dostoevsky declared that suffering is the furnace where consciousness is forged. He did not romanticize it. He did not glorify weakness. He simply revealed that pain exposes what nothing else can: the architecture of desire, the fragility of identity, the hidden attachments that shape the soul. Until one suffers, one does not know what one truly fears, what one truly clings to, what one refuses to surrender. Suffering strips life down to its core, revealing the raw nerve of existence with a clarity no amount of reflection can achieve. The first truth Dostoevsky forces us to confront is that suffering is not accidental. It is inherent to being conscious. To be aware is to be wounded. To desire is to risk loss. To hope is to risk shattering. The misunderstanding that suffering is a sign of failure collapses under his scrutiny. Life itself is structured around finitude, fragility, and uncertainty. Pain is not the exception, but the rule. The human being spends enormous energy resisting this truth, constructing illusions of control, safety, predictability. Yet suffering arrives precisely where these illusions crack. It is the moment the self is forced to face reality without its armor. And the conclusion is merciless. Suffering does not enter when life goes wrong. It enters when truth begins to surface. The second truth slices deeper. Suffering reveals the limits of the rational self. In moments of pain, logic becomes powerless. Explanations collapse. Narratives dissolve. The conscious mind, which once believed it governed, breaks under the weight of emotions it cannot contain. The unconscious rises with its ancient force, exposing wounds buried beneath years of distraction. This exposure terrifies the self because it threatens its sense of coherence. Yet Dostoevsky insists that this threat is the beginning of healing. Only when the surface fractures can the deeper self be seen. Only when the mind loses its false sovereignty can transformation begin. The third truth emerges from the wreckage. Suffering expands the soul. In its rawest form, pain strips away ego. It humbles, it clarifies, it cleanses. The person who suffers becomes capable of compassion, because they have seen their own vulnerability without disguise. They become capable of authenticity because pretense loses its value. They become capable of connection because suffering dissolves the sharp edges of pride. Dostoevsky rejects the naive optimism that suffering automatically ennobles. Instead, he reveals a harsher law. Suffering either breaks the self or opens it, and the path it takes depends on whether the individual can bear to see themselves without illusion. In the modern world, this confrontation becomes even more brutal. Today, in 2025, society has declared war on discomfort. Pain is treated as a glitch, a sign that something needs to be medicated, optimized, outsourced, or corrected. Emotional distress is labeled dysfunction. Spiritual anguish is pathologized. Sorrow is treated as inefficiency. The cultural mandate is relentless. Be fine, be stable, be productive. Yet beneath this demand lies a silent catastrophe. People are losing the ability to suffer meaningfully. They experience pain, but refuse to face it. They numb it with distraction, mask it with positivity, drown it in entertainment or self-improvement. And because they do not engage with suffering, they do not understand themselves. This avoidance deepens the wound. Pain unaddressed becomes distortion. It transforms into anxiety, bitterness, apathy, or self-sabotage. The individual becomes haunted by an unnamed ache that follows them into every decision, every relationship, every silence. Dostoevsky saw this long before modern society industrialized emotional avoidance. He understood that the attempt to escape suffering only multiplies it. The soul will not be silenced. What is pushed down returns with sharper teeth. What is ignored becomes a shadow that erodes the self from within. Psychologically, suffering forces a confrontation with the deepest fears: insignificance, abandonment, mortality, meaninglessness. These fears cannot be solved. They can only be faced. The moment one faces them, something shifts. The self stops running. It stops bargaining. It stops trying to negotiate with life. Instead, it begins to see clearly. The frantic scramble for control dissolves, leaving behind a quieter awareness. The awareness of being human, limited yet alive. Dostoevsky suggests that this is the birthplace of humility. Pain breaks the illusion of self-sufficiency. It reveals the interconnectedness of all beings. It opens the heart to others because it has first been opened by force. His characters embody this transformation with haunting intensity. Among them stands the figure of Prince Mishkin, the so-called idiot, who suffers not from vice, but from purity. His suffering is the suffering of a heart too open, too vulnerable, too exposed to the cruelty and confusion of the world. Through him, Dostoevsky shows that suffering is not always punishment. Sometimes it is sensitivity. Mishkin's pain reveals a soul stripped of defenses, a soul that loves unguardedly in a world built on calculation. His suffering becomes illumination. It exposes the hardness of those around him, the fear underlying their desires, the violence lurking beneath their social decorum. Through Mishkin, Dostoevsky asks whether suffering is not merely a burden, but a doorway to seeing the essence of others. From this figure, we learn that suffering, at its core, is an encounter with truth. It shows who we are when nothing protects us. It shows what we value when everything else is taken. It shows what we fear losing and what we fear facing. And in showing these things, it teaches, it reshapes, it demands honesty. The individual who emerges from suffering is not the same as the one who entered. Something has been burned away. Something has been revealed. Something has been born. Synthesizing these depths, one truth rises with austere force. Suffering is not an interruption of life, but its most revealing expression. It is the mirror in which the self finally sees its reflection without distortion. It is the turning point where the soul confronts the cost of being alive. It is the ground where false identities die and genuine identity begins to take form. Modern culture fears suffering because it fears depth. It fears the silence that follows collapse. It fears the transformation that comes from vulnerability. But Dostoevsky insists that without suffering, the human being remains shallow, unresolved, unreal. Yet suffering does not end the story. It opens the door to a darker possibility, one that Dostoevsky faced without flinching. If suffering reveals the soul, then the next question becomes inescapable. What does suffering uncover when it digs too deep? When the truth it exposes is not frailty, but something far more unsettling, something that emerges from within and threatens to overturn the very idea of goodness. Evil does not enter the human being from the outside. It rises slowly from within, emerging first as a tremor beneath suffering, then as a pulse of possibility that unsettles everything we believe about ourselves. When suffering digs too deep, it does not merely expose wounds. It uncovers capacities we prefer to deny. Dostoevsky confronted this revelation with a severity that still shakes us. The roots of evil are not foreign intrusions, but internal seeds waiting for the right soil. Every human soul carries within it the embryonic outline of cruelty, selfishness, violence, and destruction, not as destiny, but as potential. And potential, when ignored, grows in the dark. Long before criminology, before psychology mapped pathology, he saw that evil is not a category, but a continuum. It begins with choices so small they appear harmless: a quiet resentment, a hidden envy, a lie told not to deceive others, but to maintain one's own illusion. Evil germinates slowly, nourished by silence, fertilized by denial. The danger does not lie in the monstrous act, but in the invisible shift preceding it. The moment one begins to justify the unjustifiable to oneself. Dostoevsky insisted that the greatest crimes begin in the most intimate corners of the human heart, and the heart often remains unaware of its transformation until the line has already been crossed. The first truth he forces us to confront is that the capacity for evil is universal. No one is exempt. Moral superiority is a myth we cling to in order to avoid the terror of recognizing our own shadow. But beneath pride lies the same volatile mixture of desire and fear that drives those we condemn. The misunderstanding that evil arises from external conditions collapses under Dostoevsky's scrutiny. Environment may trigger, society may influence, trauma may distort, but the spark that ignites wrongdoing lies within the individual. The human being contains multitudes, including the possibility of transgression. And the conclusion is sharp enough to draw blood. If placed in the right circumstances, any person might choose darkness. The second truth digs deeper. Evil emerges from distorted freedom. The same force that allows for moral greatness allows for moral collapse. Freedom without anchor becomes chaos. Freedom without responsibility becomes cruelty. Freedom without empathy becomes destruction. The unconscious begins to explore this forbidden terrain long before conscious intention forms. It fantasizes about power. It imagines escape from moral constraints. It stores resentments until they ferment. Dostoevsky shows that the shift toward evil is not abrupt. It is gradual, almost imperceptible. People slide into wrongdoing the way one descends into a dream, step by step, unaware of the moment waking reality gives way. The third truth exposes the fragility of moral identity. We believe we are good because we have not yet been tested. We mistake lack of opportunity for virtue. We assume our ethics are stable when they are often untested beliefs propped up by convenience. Dostoevsky shatters this illusion. He reveals that morality is not a permanent state, but a choice renewed in every moment. And when suffering twists perception, when desire overwhelms restraint, when loneliness corrodes judgment, when pride demands its throne, the moral self becomes unstable. In such moments, evil does not appear monstrous. It appears logical, necessary, even righteous. The individual believes they are justified, and that belief becomes the engine of transgression. This inner instability is magnified in the modern world. Today, in 2025, people are surrounded by systems that claim to explain behavior, predict actions, and classify moral risk. Yet these systems often mask a deeper truth. The more society externalizes responsibility, the more individuals lose touch with their inner danger. Evil becomes something others do, something caused by environment, something solvable through policy. But the human soul resists simplification. Beneath every optimized routine lies impatience. Beneath every curated persona lies insecurity. Beneath every moral proclamation lies a trembling will trying not to fracture. Dostoevsky warns that when a culture denies the inner roots of evil, those roots grow unchecked. Psychologically, evil often arises not from malice, but from woundedness. A person who feels unseen begins to imagine proving their existence through dominance. A person humiliated may seek revenge disguised as justice. A person suffocated by their own helplessness may crave the intoxication of control. The unconscious carries old injuries, and when suffering exposes them, the temptation to reclaim power at any cost becomes overwhelming. Evil becomes a distorted attempt at self-restoration. It is the cry of a soul that refuses to remain insignificant. Dostoevsky embodied this truth in figures who commit unforgivable acts, yet remain terrifyingly relatable. Among them stands Stavrogin, a man whose inner emptiness invites darkness, the way a void attracts gravity. He is not driven by ideology or necessity. He commits harm because he feels nothing. And in that nothingness lies the purest form of evil Dostoevsky imagined, the evil of indifference. Through Stavrogin, he reveals that the greatest danger is not the person who hates, but the person who feels no weight in their actions. The indifferent soul becomes capable of anything because nothing holds it to the world. Through this figure, we learn that evil does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it seduces with apathy. Sometimes it emerges not from passion, but from numbness. The lack of emotional resonance with one's own actions creates a void where conscience should be. In that void, every boundary dissolves. Stavrogin exemplifies the terrifying possibility that the absence of meaning can lead to the most destructive acts. Dostoevsky uses him to strip away the comforting belief that evil always announces itself. More often, it grows quietly in the silence of an unexamined life. Synthesizing these insights, a single truth emerges with chilling clarity. Evil is the shadow of human freedom. It is the price of a will capable of choosing. It is the risk inherent in consciousness. And because of this, it cannot be eradicated by social reform, moral education, or rational argument. It must be acknowledged, confronted, and integrated. A person who denies their shadow becomes controlled by it. A society that denies its capacity for evil becomes blind to the warning signs of its own collapse. Dostoevsky insists that only by recognizing the monster within can we prevent it from taking command. Yet this recognition opens a deeper question, one even more unsettling. If evil grows from the fissures inside the human being, if it emerges from the same freedom that allows for transcendence, then what happens to the soul when reason tries to contain this darkness with purity, perfection, and relentless intellectual rigor? What force rises when the mind, in its pursuit of order, slowly exhausts the very spirit that sustains it? Reason, when pushed past its proper domain, becomes a tyrant that suffocates the very spirit it claims to illuminate. After evil has revealed itself as a potential rooted in the fissures of human freedom, a darker transformation follows. The mind, terrified by its own shadow, begins to build a fortress of pure intellect to contain what it fears. But in this desperate architecture of control, something vital begins to decay. Dostoevsky understood this collapse with brutal clarity. He saw that the human being cannot live by reason alone, and that when intellect attempts to dominate the totality of existence, the soul fractures. It is this fracture that gives birth to the spiritual exhaustion of the rational man, the despair of a mind that has consumed everything except the one thing it cannot grasp: meaning. Before modern culture glorified logic, before the scientific worldview claimed to explain the human condition, Dostoevsky revealed the danger of making reason sovereign. He warned that the intellect is a brilliant instrument, but a disastrous master. It can dissect, analyze, predict, and destroy illusions, but it cannot generate purpose. It cannot create love. It cannot soothe the ache of existence. When reason encounters the abyss of human suffering, it stands mute. And when a person builds their life on pure intellect, they eventually confront the barren truth. Logic cannot carry the weight of the soul. The first truth Dostoevsky confronts us with is that excessive rationality becomes rebellion against life. The intellect, once convinced of its primacy, begins to question not only illusions, but the structures that sustain human meaning. It interrogates morality until morality dissolves. It interrogates faith until faith collapses. It interrogates purpose until nothing remains except emptiness. This is the rebellion of the mind against the world, the revolt of clarity against mystery. The misunderstanding that reason leads to peace crumbles under Dostoevsky's gaze. Pure reason, left unchecked, leads to nihilism. The more the intellect sees, the less it believes. And the conclusion is devastating. Enlightenment becomes erasure. The second truth digs deeper. Rationality, when isolated, exhausts the spirit. Human beings are not built to live in a state of perpetual analysis. The soul requires mystery, vulnerability, contradiction, softness. But the rational mind treats these as errors to be corrected. It seeks perfect coherence, perfect certainty, perfect control. In doing so, it crushes the fragile forces that give life warmth. This is why the rational man grows weary, not intellectually, but existentially. His exhaustion is not the fatigue of thinking too much, but the fatigue of feeling too little. His spirit withers because it is denied nourishment. Dostoevsky's insight here is merciless. An intellect starved of emotional and spiritual depth becomes a desert where meaning dies. The third truth emerges from the ruins of this spiritual drought. Reason cannot bear suffering. When the rational mind confronts evil, chaos, and pain, it demands explanations the universe cannot provide. And when those explanations fail, the mind turns against itself. It begins to doubt its own foundations. It begins to spiral. The intellect becomes a labyrinth with no exit, each insight leading to deeper confusion. This is the tragedy of Ivan Karamazov, Dostoevsky's most devastating embodiment of rational rebellion. Ivan's brilliance becomes his torment. His clarity becomes poison. He sees the world's injustice with such precision that he can no longer accept any justification for it. His rejection of cosmic meaning is not arrogance, but anguish. But in rejecting meaning, he rejects the possibility of reconciliation. His rebellion does not free him, it annihilates him from within. Through Ivan, Dostoevsky reveals the cost of pure intellect, spiritual implosion. Ivan does not fall because he is wicked, but because he is righteous in his refusal to accept suffering. His mind demands answers that existence refuses to give. Unable to reconcile this gap, he turns his intelligence against itself until the boundary between sanity and despair dissolves. His collapse is not psychological but metaphysical. He becomes the embodiment of a truth the modern world still refuses to admit. The mind alone cannot carry the weight of human pain. In the present age of 2025, this collapse resonates with terrifying accuracy. Ours is an era that worships rationality. Data replaces intuition. Algorithms replace judgment. Efficiency replaces wisdom. People believe that if they think enough, plan enough, optimize enough, they can eliminate suffering. But this belief only deepens despair. The more individuals intellectualize their lives, the more their inner worlds shrink. Anxiety becomes chronic, not because they lack information, but because they have too much. They see every possible outcome, every possible flaw, every possible failure. Like Ivan, they are imprisoned by clarity. The modern spirit is exhausted, not from ignorance, but from hyper-awareness. Psychologically, this exhaustion comes from the suppression of the irrational, the emotional, spiritual. When the mind rejects these dimensions, they do not disappear. They retreat into the unconscious and ferment. The rational man becomes haunted by impulses he cannot explain, desires he cannot justify, fears he cannot articulate. Instead of mastering life, he becomes mastered by the parts of himself he refuses to acknowledge. Dostoevsky understood this long before psychology named repression. He knew that the mind's attempt to purify itself from darkness only intensifies that darkness. A morality built on intellect alone collapses under its own sterility. Ivan Karamazov embodies this collapse with terrifying clarity. His rebellion begins as philosophical critique, but ends as spiritual devastation. He cannot accept a world where innocent children suffer. He cannot accept a world where moral order seems absent. His intellect demands justice, yet the universe refuses to oblige. Confronted with this contradiction, he chooses intellectual honesty over hope. But honesty without hope becomes despair. His mind fractures under the pressure of its own convictions. He becomes tormented by hallucinations, by the voice of the devil masquerading as reason. This devil is no external demon. It is the echo of Ivan's own hyper-rationality, the part of him that believes understanding is the only path to peace. And in this belief, he destroys himself. Through Ivan, Dostoevsky declares a truth that modern culture continues to ignore. Reason alone cannot save us. It can expose illusions, but it cannot build meaning. It can diagnose suffering, but cannot redeem it. It can criticize evil, but cannot overcome it. When reason tries to become the entire foundation of life, the self collapses under the weight of its incompleteness. The rational man becomes spiritually starved, haunted by questions he cannot silence, emptied by answers that offer no solace. Synthesizing these insights, one truth emerges with relentless force. The rebellion of the intellect ends not in triumph, but in exhaustion. A mind that refuses mystery becomes a graveyard of meaning. A mind that refuses emotion becomes a machine. A mind that refuses imperfection becomes its own executioner. The rational man, in seeking purity, destroys the very soul that could have sustained him. Dostoevsky does not condemn reason. He condemns its absolutism. He shows that intellect without compassion becomes cruelty. Intellect without faith becomes nihilism. Intellect without humility becomes madness. Yet, this collapse of rationality opens another fissure, one even more pervasive than the rebellion of the intellect. For if the mind, exhausted and fractured, can no longer hold the self together, then the deeper question emerges with a quiet but devastating inevitability. What happens when consciousness itself begins to fragment. When identity becomes divided, unstable, and dispersed across the shifting landscapes of modern existence. Consciousness, once fractured by the exhaustion of pure intellect, does not collapse in a single direction. It shatters outward, dispersing into fragments that drift without center or cohesion. This fragmentation is the silent catastrophe Dostoevsky foresaw long before modern life perfected it. When the mind can no longer bear the weight of its own clarity, it begins to divide itself into masks, performances, roles, and contradictory impulses struggling to coexist. What was once a unified self becomes a shifting constellation of identities, each competing for dominion, yet none capable of sustaining meaning. This condition is not insanity. It is the hidden architecture of the modern soul. Dostoevsky understood that the human being is not one self, but many selves, layered atop one another like sediment. Under the pressure of suffering, under the rebellion of reason, under the weight of moral contradiction, these layers pull apart. The person begins to live in pieces. They speak with one voice in public, another in solitude. They desire one thing, but pursue another. They believe in goodness, yet feel impulses that contradict it. They strive for coherence, yet act in ways that fracture it. Fragmentation is not failure. It is the soul's response to the unbearable tension of existence. And in the age of hyperconsciousness and relentless self-analysis, this fragmentation becomes the dominant mode of being. The first truth Dostoevsky draws from this condition is that divided consciousness is the natural outcome of a world that demands contradiction. Society expects strength, but punishes vulnerability. It demands authenticity, but rewards performance. It glorifies individuality, yet enforces conformity. The self responds by splitting. It becomes adaptive, fluid, suspended between conflicting expectations. The misunderstanding that fragmentation is pathology collapses here. Fragmentation is survival. It allows the person to navigate incompatible demands by separating emotional, moral, and intellectual realities into compartments. The tragedy is not the fragmentation itself, but the loss of a center strong enough to hold the fragments together. The second truth cuts deeper. The fragment itself becomes haunted by doubt. Each internal voice questions the authority of the others. Each impulse undermines its opposite. The person grows suspicious of their own motives, uncertain of their own desires, distrustful of their own identity. The more one tries to define oneself, the more elusive the self becomes. This inner suspicion deteriorates into existential fatigue, the same fatigue that consumed Ivan Karamazov, but now dispersed into 1,000 microfractures within consciousness. Reason no longer rebels against the world. It rebels against the other parts of the self. The result is a labyrinth of introspection in which no stable center exists. The third truth emerges from the chaos. Fragmentation erodes moral grounding. Dostoevsky saw that a coherent ethical life requires a coherent self. When identity disperses, responsibility disperses with it. One fragment rationalizes what another condemns. One fragment desires what another fears. One fragment commits harm while another claims innocence. This internal disunity allows for duplicity, not out of malice, but out of disintegration. The person cannot align action with belief because belief itself has become a shifting landscape. The misunderstanding that moral failure always arises from intention dissolves here. Much of human wrongdoing arises from fragmentation, the inability to unify conflicting impulses into a stable moral identity. In the modern world of 2025, this fragmentation has become epidemic. Technology multiplies identities. Social media manufactures personas. Work demands one version of the self. Relationships demand another. Digital life encourages constant reinvention. Algorithms reflect curated versions of who we are, not who we feel ourselves to be. The self becomes a project rather than a presence, a simulation rather than a soul. People live in networks of mirrors, each one reflecting a slightly different shape, until the original form is lost in the endless refractions. Dostoevsky foresaw this long before our age gave it vocabulary. His characters live in these fissures. They are not symbolic, they are prophetic. Psychologically, fragmentation becomes a defense against unbearable truth. When the self fears its own impulses, it splits. When the self fears intimacy, it splits. When the self fears responsibility, it splits. These divisions allow the person to maintain equilibrium, but they do so at the cost of wholeness. The unconscious pushes forward forbidden desires, unacceptable emotions, unresolved guilt. The conscious self pushes them back with equal force. And in this push and pull, the self becomes divided into roles: the moral self, the instinctual self, the rational self, the wounded self, the hidden self that dreams of destruction or transcendence. Each fragment believes it is the true one. Each fragment denies the validity of the others. This internal war consumes enormous spiritual energy, leaving the person depleted. Dostoevsky's characters embody this internal war through contradictions that would appear impossible in any simplistic psychology. Dmitry Karamazov is simultaneously passionate and remorseful, violent and tender, chaotic and sincere. Raskolnikov is both murderer and moralist, both cold thinker and trembling soul. These characters are not paradoxes. They are accurate portrayals of the modern psyche. They reveal that human consciousness is not linear, but layered, not consistent, but turbulent. They show that virtue and depravity can coexist within the same individual, each part justified by its own internal narrative. Among these fractured souls, one figure illustrates the collapse of unity most clearly: Kirillov. Obsessed with the idea of absolute freedom, he attempts to transcend the limits of human existence through pure will. But his pursuit of a unified, godlike identity only intensifies his fragmentation. His rational ideals and emotional reality diverge until they tear him apart. Kirillov's tragedy lies in his inability to accept that the human self cannot be purified of contradiction. His fragmentation becomes fatal because he demands unity of a being made of fissures. Through him, Dostoevsky reveals that the pursuit of absolute coherence is itself a form of madness. From this, a sharper insight emerges. Fragmentation is not simply an inner phenomenon. It radiates outward into every dimension of life. The fragmented person struggles with commitment because commitment requires continuity of self. They struggle with desire because desire shifts with each fragment. They struggle with meaning because meaning requires unity. The person becomes a shifting field of temporary convictions, fleeting emotions, unstable purposes. Life becomes a maze of partial selves, each fighting for brief dominance, but none strong enough to define a path. This is why the modern individual often feels unreal, not because they lack identity, but because they have too many. The self becomes diluted across contexts, scattered across obligations, stretched across images. The core becomes hollow, not through absence, but through overpopulation. Dostoevsky warns that when consciousness becomes too dispersed, it loses not only coherence, but depth. Fragmentation is not expansion, it is thinning. The self becomes translucent, barely casting a shadow on the world. Yet fragmentation does more than dissipate the inner world. It destabilizes relationships. A divided self cannot fully love because love demands presence. It cannot fully trust because trust requires coherence. It cannot fully surrender because surrender requires unity. Thus, modern intimacy becomes shallow, unstable, filled with longing yet devoid of anchoring. People oscillate between closeness and withdrawal, vulnerability and defense, desire and fear. Dostoevsky knew this oscillation well. He understood that love becomes impossible when the self is scattered. Synthesizing these fractured truths, one unyielding insight emerges. Fragmentation is the silent epidemic beneath modern suffering. It fuels anxiety, alienation, moral confusion, relational collapse, and existential despair. It transforms the human being into a fluctuating consciousness, unable to commit, unable to rest, unable to recognize itself. Dostoevsky does not present fragmentation as a flaw to be corrected, but as a condition to be confronted. To heal, the self must reclaim its center, but that center cannot be found through reason alone, nor through rebellion, nor through introspection. It requires something more primal, more instinctive, something that rises not from logic or identity, but from the deepest chambers of the human heart, where meaning is forged not through analysis, but through connection. And in that dim chamber where fragmentation meets longing, another force begins to stir, one capable of binding fractured cells into something whole enough to endure. Love does not enter the fractured self as comfort. It enters as disruption, as a force that refuses to let fragmentation continue unchallenged. When consciousness has splintered into competing fragments, when reason has exhausted itself, when suffering has hollowed the core and evil has shown its lurking presence, something unexpected rises from beneath the ruins. It is not logic. It is not willpower. It is not rebellion. It is a trembling, perilous opening toward another human being. Dostoevsky understood that love is the only force strong enough to gather the broken pieces of the self and bind them into something capable of enduring its own existence. Love confronts the human being not with clarity, but with exposure. And in that exposure, wholeness becomes possible again. Before psychology spoke of attachment, before philosophy analyzed ethics of care, Dostoevsky declared a truth that destabilizes the entire architecture of modern rationality. Love is not an emotion, but a revelation. It reveals the self to itself by showing what it allows another to see. It reveals the fragility hidden beneath strength, the longing hidden beneath cynicism, the tenderness buried beneath years of self-protection. Love exposes where the fractures lie, and in exposing them forces a choice. Remain fragmented or surrender to connection. But this surrender is not gentle. It feels like risk, even danger, because it demands the dissolution of the masks the fragmented self uses for survival. The first truth Dostoevsky forces upon us is that love disrupts autonomy. For the fractured self, autonomy is cherished because it allows each fragment to remain sovereign. Love challenges this sovereignty by drawing the self toward unity through vulnerability. It demands honesty where the fragmented self prefers secrecy. It demands presence where the fragmented self prefers distance. The misunderstanding that love is harmonious collapses here. Real love is confrontation. It strips away illusions, dismantles defenses, and reveals the raw, unedited psyche. The person who loves cannot hide behind intellect, rebellion, or fragmentation. Love pulls them into relational truth. The second truth cuts deeper. Love awakens moral responsibility. Fragmentation allows the self to evade responsibility by dispersing identity across multiple roles and impulses. But love gathers these fragments into the gaze of another person who sees through them. This gaze becomes a mirror the fragmented self cannot escape. The person is forced to confront who they have become, what they fear, and what they desire. The presence of another soul compels integration. Love creates accountability not through obligation, but through devotion. It asks, who are you when someone else depends on the truth of your being? This question destabilizes the evasions that fragmentation relies on. The third truth Dostoevsky exposes is perhaps most painful. Love requires sacrifice, but not the sacrifice of self-annihilation. It demands the sacrifice of pride, the sacrifice of defenses, the sacrifice of the internal walls built to protect the self from past wounds. Love requires the person to risk being seen in their weakness, not their strength. It requires the courage to let another witness the shadow, the fear, the longing for redemption. The common belief that love is primarily joy dissolves under Dostoevsky's gaze. Love is a difficult awakening. It is joy sharpened by truth, tenderness sharpened by responsibility, intimacy sharpened by the possibility of loss. Yet precisely through this difficulty, love becomes transformative. This transformation becomes visible in the modern world, where fragmentation is the dominant condition. Today, in 2025, relationships are haunted by the instability of divided selves. People seek connection through curated images, through ephemeral interactions, through performances of confidence that conceal insecurity. Love becomes commodified, optimized, strategized, dissected. Yet beneath this superficial machinery, the human yearning for genuine connection intensifies. The lonelier the age becomes, the more desperate its search for intimacy. But intimacy cannot anchor itself in a fragmented soul until something within that soul shifts. Dostoevsky shows that shift through love's power to demand authenticity. Psychologically, Love acts as a counterforce to fragmentation. It creates a gravitational pull toward unity. The self, which once dispersed its identity to shield itself from pain, begins to gather around a new center, the relational bond. This gathering is not immediate. It is slow, tremulous, often resisted. The unconscious, shaped by past wounds, fears exposure. The conscious mind fears dependency. The rational mind fears uncertainty. Yet love persists as a quiet insistence that the fragment itself can become whole, not through isolation, but through communion. It does not erase conflict, it integrates it. It does not erase darkness, it makes room for it to be acknowledged within the light of connection. Dostoevsky's characters reveal this integration with merciless clarity. Among them stands Sonia from Crime and Punishment, whose love is not romantic sentiment, but an act of spiritual courage. Sonia does not demand that Raskolnikov become pure before she accepts him. She accepts him so that he may become capable of purity. Her love does not excuse his crime. It exposes its true weight. It draws him out of arrogance into repentance. Through her, Dostoevsky shows that love has the power to confront evil, not with condemnation, but with compassion strong enough to hold the sinner accountable without abandoning him. Sonia does not save Raskolnikov through logic or persuasion. She saves him by seeing the part of him that still longs for redemption. Through Sonia, we learn that love does not cure fragmentation by restoring innocence. It cures fragmentation by awakening conscience. It binds the fractured self not through control, but through recognition. It sees the brokenness clearly, yet refuses to turn away. In that refusal, the beloved experiences something they had deemed impossible, being fully seen and not rejected. That experience becomes the catalyst for moral rebirth. Love calls forth the self that has not yet lived but could. It becomes the bridge between who the person is and who they might become. Yet this bridging does not come without danger. Love exposes the soul to two devastating possibilities: transformation or collapse. Many are not prepared for the vulnerability it demands. The fragmented self may recoil, sabotage, retreat into isolation. Dostoevsky knew that love, like suffering, is a trial. It tests the strength of the self's desire to become whole. It tests whether one can bear intimacy without fleeing into the safety of solitude. It tests how deeply one is willing to confront their own. Darkness. Love is not sentimental in his world. It is surgical. It cuts where the soul has hardened. It heals where the soul has despaired. Synthesizing these insights, a truth emerges with decisive clarity. Love is the only force capable of stitching the fragmented self back into unity. Not through comfort, but through confrontation. Not through illusion, but through truth. Not through idealization, but through vulnerability. It demands the courage to remain present, even when the self trembles. It demands the humility to be shaped by another's presence. It demands the strength to allow meaning to emerge, not from isolation, but from relationship. Dostoevsky reveals that love is not the opposite of suffering, but its companion, the force that transforms suffering from chaos into depth. Where suffering exposes the soul's fractures, Love begins the slow work of binding them. Yet as love gathers the fragments, something else begins to stir in the background, something more insidious than fragmentation and more subtle than despair. For once the self has tasted unity through love, it faces a new temptation, the temptation to impose a rigid internal order, to govern the soul with the same authority it once fled from in the world. And in this attempt to control the inner realm completely, the human being risks creating a silent tyranny within themselves, a tyranny far more suffocating than any external force. The moment love begins stitching the fragmented self together, a new danger emerges. The human being, terrified of losing this fragile coherence, begins to impose discipline on the soul with a force more rigid than any external authority. What was once chaos becomes order, but order quickly calcifies into domination. This is the silent tyranny Dostoevsky foresaw, not the tyranny of governments or doctrines, but the tyranny each person builds within themselves when they attempt to perfect their own existence. Once the self has tasted unity, it fears collapse so deeply that it constructs an interior regime of surveillance, punishment, and self-regulation. And in this attempt to protect the soul, the individual ends up suffocating it. Before modern psychology spoke of perfectionism, before contemporary culture turned self-optimization into a religion, Dostoevsky already warned that the greatest authoritarian force is internal. The human being who tries to control their own soul with absolute precision becomes a warden overseeing their own imprisonment. They discipline their impulses, censor their desires, monitor their emotions, and punish every deviation from their ideal self. This inner overseer believes it is acting in the name of goodness, virtue, clarity, or self-improvement. But beneath its good intentions lies fear. Fear of disorder, fear of weakness, fear of vulnerability, fear of the return of fragmentation. The first truth Dostoevsky compels us to confront is that the quest for inner perfection becomes indistinguishable from inner oppression. The individual begins to demand from themselves a level of purity no human being can maintain. They expect unwavering focus, unwavering moral discipline, unwavering emotional stability. They measure every thought, every impulse, every reaction against an impossible standard. The misunderstanding that self-control is always virtue collapses here. Excessive self-control becomes violence. It crushes spontaneity. It erases tenderness. It denies the legitimacy of human imperfection. The soul, once fragmented, now becomes imprisoned under an iron ideal. The second truth cuts deeper. Internal tyranny grows strongest where love has previously begun to heal. The self, newly exposed through love's vulnerability, now fears losing what it has gained. It begins to police itself in order to remain worthy of the love it has received. It fears disappointing the beloved. It fears regression. It fears the return of darkness. This fear drives the person to suppress their impulses, sanitize their emotions, and sculpt themselves into an image they believe will guarantee belonging. But love cannot survive in the sterile environment of self-punishment. The more one disciplines the soul to appear perfect, the more distant and artificial one becomes. Dostoevsky shows that inner tyranny destroys the very intimacy the self is trying to preserve. The third truth emerges with devastating clarity. Self-oppression masquerades as moral responsibility. The individual convinces themselves that their rigidity is necessary, that their severity is ethical, that their internal demands are justified. They mistake fear for duty. They mistake perfection for integrity. They mistake self-harm for discipline. This confusion becomes lethal to the spirit. The person loses the ability to distinguish between genuine conscience and internalized coercion. Their desires become suspect. Their emotions become threats. Their humanity becomes an obstacle. Dostoevsky reveals that a conscience distorted, fear becomes indistinguishable from a tyrant. In the world of 2025, this inner tyranny has metastasized into a cultural epidemic. People live under constant pressure to improve, optimize, refine, and perfect themselves. Productivity becomes virtue. Efficiency becomes identity. Emotional regulation becomes mandatory. Social standards seep into the psyche until the person becomes both prisoner and guard. Self-help becomes self-surveillance. Wellness becomes obedience to an invisible system of demands. The modern individual punishes themselves for rest, for doubt, for imperfection, for slowness, for sadness. And beneath this punishment lies the belief that the self must be constantly monitored to remain acceptable. Psychologically, internal tyranny arises from the collision of fear and aspiration. The person aspires to goodness, clarity, connection, but they fear their own impulses, their own darkness, their own contradictions. This fear produces hypervigilance. The mind scans for flaws. The heart censors vulnerability. The will condemns deviation. Instead of embracing their full humanity, the individual narrows themselves into a caricature of who they believe they should be. They become rigid where life demands flexibility. They become harsh where healing requires softness. They become controlled where growth requires surrender. The self shrinks under the weight of its own expectations. Dostoevsky illustrated this internal collapse through characters whose pursuit of moral purity leads them into spiritual ruin. Among them stands Alyosha Karamazov, the gentle monk whose purity is constantly threatened by the world's chaos. Yet Alyosha's salvation lies not in self-repression, but in his refusal to rule his soul with an iron hand. He does not deny his impulses. He acknowledges them. He does not impose perfection. He seeks humility. Alyosha embodies the possibility of inner freedom, not freedom from weakness, but freedom from the need to dominate it. Through him, Dostoevsky shows that spiritual health comes not from erasing one's contradictions, but from accepting them with compassion. But for every Alyosha, there exists a soul like the Grand Inquisitor in Ivan's parable, a figure who believes that people are too weak for freedom and must be controlled for their own good. This figure is not merely symbolic of institutions. It symbolizes the internal authority each person constructs within themselves. The Inquisitor believes he is protecting humanity, yet he suffocates it. In the same way, the individual who governs their inner world with excessive discipline believes they are ensuring their own survival, yet they extinguish their own vitality. The tyranny of the Inquisitor becomes the tyranny of the inner critic. From these parallel figures, a stark truth emerges. The struggle between freedom and control is not fought in society, but within the soul. Human beings long for freedom, but fear the chaos it reveals. They long for order, but fear the rigidity it imposes. This tension produces the silent phenomenon Dostoevsky warned about: self-administered totalitarianism. The individual becomes their own oppressor. They create rules no one asked them to follow. They punish themselves for impulses that harm no one. They silence desires that might lead to connection. They police emotions that might reveal truth. And in this internal crackdown, life becomes a performance of discipline rather than an experience of being. This internal tyranny affects not only the individual, but their relationships. A person who fears their own imperfection fears intimacy. They enter connection armored, guarded, restrained. They offer glimpses, but never presence. They love cautiously, withholding parts of themselves out of fear they are unworthy. And as they police their inner world, they begin to police others, demanding from them the same impossible perfection they demand from themselves. Love becomes conditional. Vulnerability becomes threat. Connection becomes a negotiation of control, not a meeting of souls. Synthesizing these insights, one truth rises with the finality of a verdict. The greatest prisons are built from ideals, not vices. The human being, in its desperate attempt to govern itself, can lose the very qualities that make it human. Internal tyranny destroys spontaneity, authenticity, creativity, tenderness, faith, and joy. It leaves the self morally rigid, but spiritually dead. Dostoevsky's warning is not that control is wrong, but that total control is impossible without sacrificing the soul. Yet even this silent tyranny is not the final horizon of the human journey. For once the individual recognizes the prison they have built inside themselves, another possibility arises. A possibility not of escape into chaos, nor surrender into perfection, but a different form of freedom altogether. A freedom that emerges not from defeating darkness, but from reconciling with it. A freedom that begins only when the human being dares to meet themselves without armor, without tyranny, without fear. The journey through Dostoevsky's thought ends where it began, in the quiet place where the human being must finally face themselves without disguise. After freedom has wounded us, after the unconscious has risen, after reason has rebelled, after fragmentation has scattered identity, and after love has exposed our trembling core, one truth remains impossible to escape. We are creatures suspended between darkness and light, and only by acknowledging both can we begin to live honestly. Dostoevsky does not offer salvation, and he does not promise clarity. He offers something far more demanding. He asks us to stand in front of our own depths without turning away. What his philosophy ultimately reveals is not a doctrine, but a posture of being. It is the posture of one who refuses to lie to themselves. It is the courage to see freedom as burden, suffering, teacher, evil as possibility, love as revelation, and the inner tyrant as the final barrier to humanity. It is the recognition that the soul is not perfected through control, but awakened through truthfulness. And this truthfulness requires an encounter with the shadows we spend our lives avoiding. Dostoevsky's world is filled with fractured, conflicted, wounded beings, yet each of them carries within their ruin a spark of something unextinguished. He insists that light is not the absence of darkness, but the transformation of it. In the end, his philosophy demands a question rather than an answer. A question that follows us into silence, that lingers in the spaces between our choices, that presses against the walls of the selves we construct for survival. It is a question that feels gentle in its wording, yet heavy in its consequences. What are you still running from within yourself? The moment we dare to respond, not with excuses, but with honesty, the long-buried light he believed in begins to flicker. Not triumphantly, not completely, but unmistakably. And perhaps that flicker is enough. Enough to begin. Enough to confront. Enough to live without fleeing the truth of who we are. In Dostoevsky's vision, redemption does not arrive as revelation. It arrives in the quiet recognition that the soul, even in its darkest hour, is still capable of awakening to itself.